The first time Grace Ellison broke Caleb Whitmore's heart, she did it with a microphone in her hand and the whole country watching. The ballroom on the top floor of the Whitmore Legacy Tower glittered like a promise too expensive to question. Crystal chandeliers spilled gold across white roses, champagne glasses, and a sea of investors, journalists, family friends, and board members who had come to witness more than an engagement announcement. They had come to witness stability. They had come to see Caleb Whitmore, the 35-year-old billionaire chief executive officer of Whitmore Legacy Group, stand beside the woman he loved and prove that the empire his father built was still untouchable. Cameras lined the back wall. A live broadcast counter glowed red above the press platform. 3 million viewers were already watching. Caleb stood beneath the soft lights in a midnight blue suit, tall, composed, and carved out of the kind of confidence that made nervous shareholders breathe easier. Beside him, Grace Ellison smiled with both hands folded in front of her, her white dress simple, elegant, and nothing like the diamond-draped women whispering from the front tables. She was 28, a former communications director for the Whitmore Foundation, the kind of woman who remembered security guards by name and once spent an entire winter organizing coats for families in Queens. To Caleb, she was the only person in the building who had ever looked at him and seen a man before a fortune. To everyone else, she was still the girl who had somehow been invited into a world that loved gates, last names, and silent judgment. Caleb turned toward her, and for one small second, the room disappeared from his eyes. His expression softened. Grace nearly forgot what she had to do. Nearly. Then she saw Richard Vail standing behind the velvet curtain near the side corridor, his silver hair neat, his black tuxedo immaculate, one hand resting on a sealed gray folder. He did not need to speak. The warning was already inside her chest. 30 minutes earlier, he had found her alone in the bridal suite, while the makeup artist packed away brushes and the stylist adjusted the veil she would wear for tomorrow's private ceremony. Richard had closed the door with the calm of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to ruin a life. "You will end it tonight," he had said. Grace had stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon." He laid the folder on the vanity between perfume bottles and pearl pins. Inside were financial documents, edited audit reports, emails with Caleb's forged approval, and a copy of the late Thomas Whitmore's will. Richard tapped one paragraph with his finger. If Caleb causes severe reputational damage to Whitmore Legacy Group before the wedding is finalized, the board may remove him by emergency vote. Grace felt the blood leave her face. "These documents are false. False enough to be corrected later," Richard said. "Real enough to destroy him first. Why are you showing me this?" "Because Caleb loves two things. You, and the empire his father left him. If he keeps both tomorrow, I lose. If you break his heart tonight, the board loses its cleanest excuse to remove him." Grace had looked at the papers, then at the engagement ring shining on her hand. "You want me to humiliate him. I want you to be useful." Richard's voice had stayed polite, which made it worse. "Tell him he loves the company more than you. Make it public. Make it believable. If you warn him, I release everything before midnight. If you refuse, by morning he will lose the company, and every employee who depends on it will learn your love story cost them their future." Now, standing beside Caleb in front of the cameras, Grace could still feel the folder like a weight against her ribs. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and took out the ring box. The audience warmed with applause before he even opened it. The same ring was already on her hand, but tonight he planned to place it there again for the cameras, a symbol for the investors, the public, and the legacy that had followed him since childhood like a crown made of duty. Caleb looked at her, his voice low enough that only the front microphones caught it. "Grace Ellison, tomorrow I was supposed to marry you in private. Tonight, I want everyone to know I would choose you in any room, before any crowd, under any name." Her heart folded in on itself. For one wild moment, she wanted to tell the truth. She wanted to turn to the cameras and point at Richard. She wanted to say that the empire Caleb loved had snakes curled beneath its marble floors. But Richard lifted the gray folder slightly from the shadows, and Grace saw the faces beyond Caleb. Hotel workers watching from a staff balcony, foundation employees near the back, assistants, drivers, receptionists, people whose paychecks, health insurance, and mortgages were tied to the company Caleb had sworn to protect. Grace drew one breath. Then she stepped back. The applause thinned. Caleb's hand froze with the ring box open. Grace lifted the microphone from the stand. Her fingers trembled, so she held it with both hands. "I cannot do this," she said. The ballroom went silent. Caleb blinked once, as if the words had arrived in a language he did not know. "Grace." She looked straight at him because if she looked away, she would not survive it. "I cannot marry a man who loves his empire more than me." A sound moved through the room, soft and terrible, like silk tearing. Caleb's face changed slowly. Not anger first. Confusion. Then pain. Then the cold public mask trying to rise too late to hide either one. "What are you saying?" he asked. Grace forced herself to smile, and the smile felt like glass. "I am saying I will not spend my life competing with a company, a board, and a dead man's dream." His father. She had used his father. The one wound she knew would make him stop reaching for her. Caleb lowered the ring box. "Do not do this here." "Where should I do it, Caleb?" "In another room where your lawyers can turn my feelings into a clause." The cameras moved closer. Somewhere near the back, Sloane Mercer covered her mouth with perfect theatrical shock, already stepping into the role of the woman who would comfort him later. Richard watched from the shadows, expression unreadable, but Grace saw satisfaction in the stillness of his shoulders. Caleb looked at Grace as if searching for the woman who had held his hand through his father's memorial, who had told him that leadership meant knowing. The names of the people who cleaned the floors. She was still there. She was trapped behind every cruel word. Grace removed the ring from her finger. The diamond caught the chandelier light one final time before slipping from her hand. It struck the polished floor with a small, bright sound that every microphone captured. Caleb did not move. Neither did Grace. The broadcast counter kept glowing red. The entire country watched the ring spin between them, slower and slower, until it stopped at Caleb Whitmore's feet. And behind the curtain, Richard Vale quietly closed the gray folder, because Grace had just broken the man she loved exactly the way he had ordered her to. For 3 seconds after the ring stopped spinning at Caleb Whitmore's feet, nobody inside the ballroom remembered how to breathe. The cameras kept recording. The chandeliers kept glowing. The champagne kept trembling in untouched glasses. Caleb stood beneath all that gold light with the open ring box in his hand, and the woman he loved standing 10 feet away, her face pale, her fingers empty, her words still hanging between them like a door slammed shut. Grace Ellison did not move because if she moved too soon, her knees might fail her. She could feel every eye in the room turning her into a headline. The poor fiancée who wanted more. The ungrateful woman who walked away from a billionaire. The girl who proved she never belonged among the Whitmores. She had known it would hurt Caleb. She had not known it would feel like cutting a piece of herself out and leaving it on the polished floor beside his ring. Caleb finally bent down and picked it up. Not quickly, not angrily, slowly, with the precise control of a man refusing to give the world the satisfaction of watching him break twice. When he straightened, his eyes found hers. The warmth was gone. In its place was something colder than rage. Disbelief. Was any of it real? He asked, his voice low enough that only Grace and the nearest microphones could hear. That question almost destroyed her. Because the truth was simple. Every laugh in the back of his car after late board meetings. Every Sunday morning when she made him pancakes badly and he ate them anyway. Every night she held him while he stared at old photographs of his father. All of it had been real. Too real. Real enough that she had just chosen to lose it to save the thing he could not survive losing. She forced her mouth to form the answer Richard needed the world to hear. Real things still end. Caleb's face closed. Whatever had been reaching toward her disappeared behind the Whitmore name. Behind his father's legacy. Behind years of training that told him pain was acceptable only if no one could prove it existed. He put the ring into the box, shut it with a soft click, and turned to the crowd. This event is over, he said. No apology. No explanation. No plea. Just a command wrapped in silence. Security moved gently through the room, guiding guests toward the elevators. Reporters shouted questions, but Caleb walked past them without looking at Grace again. That was the first punishment. Not anger. Not accusation. His refusal to see her. Grace remained where she stood until Richard appeared at her side, calm as a shadow. Well done, he murmured. She did not look at him. You promised not to release the documents. And I am a man of my word when it benefits me. His smile was thin. For tonight, Caleb keeps his chair. For tonight. Richard adjusted his cufflink. Empires are not saved in one evening, Miss Ellison. They are negotiated. Before she could answer, Sloane Mercer swept past them in a silver gown, her expression arranged into sympathy for anyone watching. She paused just long enough to whisper, "You should leave before they remember you came from the Foundation payroll." Then she followed the direction Caleb had gone, graceful, polished, ready to stand near whatever power had been wounded. Grace walked out through a service corridor because she could not bear the main exit. A kitchen worker she recognized from the Foundation gala saw her and opened a side door without a word. The January air hit her like a slap of ice. Rain had started, thin and sharp, cutting through the thin fabric of her dress as she stepped into the alley behind Whitmore Legacy Tower. Her phone vibrated until her hand went numb. Unknown numbers. News alerts. Friends asking if she was safe. Her mother calling from Ohio. Grace could not answer any of them. She climbed into a yellow taxi at the curb and gave the driver the address of her small apartment in Queens. The city blurred outside the window, all wet pavement and red brake lights, while the live broadcast replayed silently on the screen in the back of the cab. There she was again, lifting the microphone. There was Caleb, frozen. There was the ring striking the floor. A news anchor's caption appeared beneath their faces. Billionaire groom humiliated as fiancé, claims he chose empire over love. Grace pressed her fingers to the pale circle on her skin where the ring had been. The mark remained, a soft dent in her finger, proof that love could leave even when the diamond did not. She did not cry loudly. She did not fall apart in a way anyone could photograph. Tears simply slipped down her face while the driver kept his eyes on the road and pretended not to notice. Across town, Caleb returned to his private office on the 62nd floor after midnight. The tower was nearly empty, its glass walls reflecting a man who looked untouched if one did not know where to look. His chief of staff, Daniel Price, waited near the conference table with a tablet in his hand and worry on his face. The market reaction shifted, Daniel said carefully. The financial scandal is being pushed below the engagement story. Whitmore stock stopped falling in after-hours trading. Caleb gave a short laugh, without humor. So her public execution of my character was good for business. Caleb, do not. Daniel lowered his eyes. Caleb walked to his desk. Grace's framed photograph sat beside a silver paperweight engraved with his father's initials. In the photo, she was laughing at a Foundation picnic, hair loose in the wind, holding a paper plate and looking at him like he was not a balance sheet. Caleb picked up the frame. For a second, his hand tightened. Then he placed it face down in the drawer. He removed the seating chart for the wedding dinner. The handwritten note Grace had left him last week. The small card that said, Remember to eat lunch, billionaire. Each piece went into the drawer, but when he reached for the ring box, he could not put it away. He opened it and stared at the diamond resting inside like a question he hated. She knew exactly what to say, he whispered. Daniel hesitated. Maybe she was trying to hurt you enough to make people believe it. Caleb looked up. Why would she need people to believe it? Before Daniel could answer, Caleb's phone lit up with a message from Richard Vale. You handled yourself well tonight. Your father would have chosen the company too. Caleb stared at the words, and something small and dangerous shifted behind his grief, because Grace had used his father to wound him, and now Richard had used the same wound to comfort him. Grace Ellison's apartment in Queens was only 600 square feet, but that night it felt too large for one broken heart to survive. She came in quietly, as if sound itself might tell the neighbors what she had done, then locked the door and leaned against it with her eyes closed. The rain followed her in thin silver lines down her hair, along the sleeves of her white dress, onto the scratched wood floor she had once promised Caleb she would let him help her replace. She had laughed then and told him not everything needed a billionaire solution. He had smiled, kissed her knuckles, and said, then let me be a fiancé solution. The memory hit harder than the cold. Grace slipped off her heels, one by one, and the silence of the apartment rushed around her. On the small kitchen table sat a half-finished seating chart for tomorrow's private wedding dinner, written in her own handwriting. Caleb beside Grace. Daniel beside Aunt Margaret. Richard Vale near the board members, because Caleb had insisted the old family advisor deserved respect. Grace stared at Richard's name until it blurred. Then she opened her purse and pulled out the folded copy of the will clause she had taken from his folder when he was not looking. Her hands shook as she spread it flat beneath the yellow kitchen light. The language was formal and clean, but the meaning was cruel. If the chief executive officer caused severe reputational harm before the marital consolidation of family trust interests, the interim board could remove him by emergency vote. Marital consolidation. Such a cold phrase for what Caleb had thought would be a wedding. Grace pressed her palm over her mouth. She could still see him in the ballroom, ring box open, eyes soft, promising to choose her in any room. He had meant it. That was what made her life feel unbearable. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother. Grace answered before courage could leave her. Mom. Gracie. Honey, what is happening? Your aunt saw you on television. People are saying terrible things. Grace closed her eyes. Her mother lived in Dayton, Ohio, in a small house with blue shutters and medical bills Grace still helped pay when she could. She knew nothing about board clauses, forged audits, or men like Richard Vale. She only knew her daughter sounded like she was standing in the dark. I am okay, Grace said. That is what you say when you are not. Grace tried to laugh, but it came out thin. I had to end it. Did he hurt you? No, that answer came fast and true. Caleb never hurt me. Then why? Grace looked at the papers on the table, at the trap built out of legal language and lies. Because someone was going to take everything his father left him, and I was the only one close enough to stop the first move. Her mother went quiet. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. Does he know that? Grace's tears finally broke free. No, he thinks I chose myself. And did you? Grace wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. No, that is the problem. After the call ended, Grace changed into an old sweatshirt and sat at the table until sunrise, replaying every detail of Richard's threat. He had shown her documents that made Caleb look guilty of moving foundation money into private accounts. The signatures were convincing. The audit trail was neat. Too neat. Grace had worked in communications long enough to know when a story had been packaged before the truth was found. Richard did not want justice. He wanted timing. He wanted the scandal released after the wedding announcement, when the board could argue Caleb had damaged both the company and the family trust. Grace breaking the engagement had not saved Caleb forever. It had only interrupted the trap. By 7 in the morning, the news had already turned her into a villain. By 8, a photographer stood across the street from her building. By 9, Sloan Mercer appeared on a morning business show in cream silk and soft lighting, speaking with practiced sadness. Caleb is a man of enormous responsibility, Sloan said. It takes a certain kind of woman to understand that an empire is not competition. It is legacy. Grace watched from her phone with cold coffee in her hand. The interviewer asked if Sloan believed Grace had been overwhelmed by Caleb's world. Sloan tilted her head. I believe some people love the idea of power until they realize power requires sacrifice. Grace turned the phone face down. Outside, a bus side at the curb. Somewhere below, a dog barked. Ordinary life went on, indifferent and almost insulting. Then an envelope slid under her apartment door. Grace froze. No knock. No footsteps she could hear. She crossed the room slowly and picked it up. Inside was a single page with no signature. A photocopy of a transfer request from a Whitmore Legacy subsidiary to a shell vendor she did not recognize. At the bottom, written in black ink, were 4 words, start with the vendors. Grace's breath caught. Someone inside the company knew. Someone else was afraid. She read the vendor name twice, then opened her laptop and searched through old foundation invoices she had saved from her communications work. The name appeared nowhere. But 3 similar companies did, all approved after Thomas Whitmore's death, all tied to community projects that had suddenly lost funding. A food program in the Bronx, a job training center in Brooklyn, a family clinic in Newark. Caleb would have noticed if the board had shown him the real numbers, which meant someone had been feeding him summaries clean enough to trust. Grace worked for hours, following small traces through public filings, charity reports, archived donor pages, and contractor addresses that led to mailboxes in Delaware. The more she found, the colder she became. Richard was not only preparing to remove Caleb. He was draining the pieces of Whitmore legacy that Caleb believed mattered most. By afternoon, a message appeared from an unknown number. You did your part. Stop looking. Grace stared at it, then looked toward the window where the photographer still waited beneath a black umbrella. Fear moved through her, but beneath it something steadier rose. She had already lost Caleb's trust. She had already given the world permission to hate her. There was nothing left to protect except the truth. Grace opened a new folder on her laptop and named it Thomas Promise, after the phrase Caleb used whenever he spoke of his father's company. Then she began copying every file she could find, every invoice, every shell vendor, every missing community grant. At the same time, 62 floors above Manhattan, Caleb sat in his office with Grace's ring box open on his desk and Richard's message still glowing on his phone. Daniel stood beside him, quiet but uneasy. You should rest, Daniel said. Caleb did not look away from the ring. Grace said I love the Empire more than her. Maybe someone wanted her to say that. Caleb's eyes lifted. Find out who spoke to her before she walked on stage. Daniel nodded. And if it was Richard? Caleb closed the ring box slowly. Then Grace did not break my heart to leave me. She broke it because someone made her choose where the damage would land. By the next morning, love had become a document with Grace Ellison's signature at the bottom. The leak appeared at 6:14 a.m., first on a business gossip site, then on every major morning show before Caleb Whitmore had finished his second cup of coffee. Daniel Price walked into Caleb's office without knocking, his face pale, his tablet already in his hand. Caleb looked up from the security report he had been reading, the one confirming Richard Vale had spent 11 minutes alone with Grace before she walked on stage. Tell me, Caleb said. Daniel placed the tablet on the desk. The headline glowed like a judgment. Secret prenuptial deal reveals Grace Ellison demanded millions before walking away. Beneath it was a scanned agreement, polished, legal, and poisonous. Grace's signature was visible on the final page. Caleb stared at it, his expression unreadable. The real agreement had been simple. Separate assets. Protection for the foundation. No claim to Whitmore Family Trust shares. Grace had insisted on that herself because she wanted no one to say she had loved him for money. But the version on the screen was different. Clauses had been inserted. A luxury apartment. A $7 million settlement. Continued access to Whitmore charitable accounts. The lies were clean enough to fool anyone who wanted to believe them. Daniel spoke carefully. This is not the agreement I reviewed. Caleb did not blink. Who had access? Legal, Richard's office, your private archive, and Grace. Her name changed the room. Caleb closed his hand around the ring box on his desk, not opening it, just holding it, as if the weight might tell him what was real. Daniel added, I still think someone is framing her. Caleb's jaw tightened. Thinking is not proof. He hated himself for saying it because the doubt did not feel like logic. It felt like injury looking for somewhere to stand. Grace had known the exact sentence that would wound him. She had used his father. She had dropped his ring in front of the country. And now the world was telling him there had been a price attached to her leaving. On the television, mounted near the conference wall, Sloan Mercer appeared in soft studio lighting, wearing pale gray and sympathy like a designer coat. The host leaned forward. Sloan, you have known Caleb Whitmore for years. Is this the kind of public heartbreak that could threaten confidence in Whitmore Legacy Group? Sloan sighed, perfectly measured. Caleb is strong, but even strong men need people around them who understand responsibility. An empire is not a romantic rival. It is a promise. Some people enter that world because they love the person. Others discover the price of that world and decide to negotiate. Caleb turned off the screen. The silence afterward felt colder than the broadcast. Across the East River, Grace watched the same clip from her apartment floor, surrounded by printed invoices, vendor filings, and half-empty coffee cups. Her hair was tied back, her eyes red from a sleepless night, and her laptop screen was filled with names of shell companies linked to Whitmore community programs. She had not eaten. She had barely moved. Then the messages began. Strangers calling her greedy. Former coworkers asking if any of it was true. A news van parked outside her building. Her landlord texted, asking whether cameras would remain on the property. Grace read the leaked agreement once, then again, and a strange calm settled over her. Richard had not just wanted Caleb to hate her. He wanted everyone to believe she had turned love into a transaction. Her phone rang. This time, it was Caleb. She stared at his name until the final vibration stopped. A moment later, a text appeared. Is it real? 4 words. No anger. No accusation. Somehow that hurt more. Grace typed, no. She deleted it. She typed, you know me. She deleted that too, because maybe he did not. Maybe the whole tragedy was that Caleb knew how to protect a company better than he knew how to trust a woman who had given up her name to protect him. Another message appeared before she could answer. Richard, stop digging, Grace. You already have the role the public gave you. Do not audition for martyr. She looked toward the window where a photographer lifted a camera from across the street. Then she turned her phone face down and went back to work. At noon, Caleb held an emergency press statement in the lobby of Whitmore Legacy Tower. Reporters filled the marble hall. Richard stood behind him on the left. Sloan stood several feet away on the right, elegant, silent, and visible enough for every camera to understand the comparison. Daniel remained near the security desk, watching Richard instead of the press. Caleb stepped to the microphone. The document circulating online is under review, he said. Whitmore Legacy Group will not comment on private legal matters until the facts are verified. A reporter shouted, Mr. Whitmore, did Grace Ellison demand money from you? Caleb's hand tightened on the podium. Richard's voice from behind him was quiet, meant only for him. Do not defend her unless you are ready to go down with her. Caleb heard it. Daniel heard it too. Caleb looked at the cameras, and for one painful second, he saw Grace standing where she had stood the night before, pretending to be cruel while her hands trembled around the microphone. He wanted to say she was not that woman. He wanted to say the Grace he loved would give away her last dollar before stealing one. But suspicion, pride, and the whole machinery of the empire pressed against his throat. I will not speak for Miss Ellison, he said finally. She made her choice public. In her apartment, Grace watched those words replay on her phone because a neighbor had sent the clip with a single message: I am sorry. She did not cry this time. Something quieter happened. She opened the top drawer of her desk and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was the engagement ring she had picked up after the ballroom emptied, before anyone could turn it into another headline. Caleb thought he had it, but the ring in his box was the display duplicate used for the broadcast. The real one, the one he had placed on her hand in his father's rose garden, was here. Grace held it in her palm, then placed it into an envelope with the first vendor transfer record and one handwritten line. If you cannot believe me, believe what they tried to hide. She slipped the envelope inside her coat and left through the back stairs while cameras waited at the front. By sunset, she reached the old Whitmore Community Center in Brooklyn, the first place where Caleb had ever told her his father's dream was not hotels, but dignity. The lights were off. The doors were chained, and taped to the glass was a notice that made Grace forget how to breathe. Funding suspended by order of Richard Vail, Interim Board Authority. Grace Ellison stood outside the chained doors of the Whitmore Community Center as the last orange light of sunset slipped between the Brooklyn buildings and turned the glass into fire. The notice on the door was printed on clean white paper, stamped with the authority of people who never had to explain themselves to the families waiting on the sidewalk. Funding suspended by order of Richard Vail, Interim Board Authority. Behind the glass, she could see the dark lobby where children used to hang paper snowflakes every December. The bulletin board covered with job training flyers, the folding tables where single mothers filled out health insurance forms, the small stage where Caleb had once stood with his sleeves rolled up, telling a room of construction workers and cafeteria staff that his father believed dignity was not charity, it was a debt owed by power. Grace touched the glass with her fingertips. It was cold. A woman in a red coat stood nearby holding the hand of a little boy with a backpack shaped like a dinosaur. They said the after-school program is canceled, the woman said, not recognizing Grace at first. Do you know when they will open again? Grace turned toward her, and the woman's eyes widened with the sudden recognition that now followed Grace everywhere. The woman looked from Grace's face to the envelope in her hand, then away, embarrassed by the headlines she had probably seen. Grace could have walked off. She could have protected what little was left of herself. Instead, she swallowed the ache in her throat and said, they will open again. Are you sure? The woman asked. Grace looked at the chained doors, at Richard's name on the notice, at the empire Caleb thought he still controlled. I am going to make sure. She did not know how when she said it. She only knew that some promises had to be spoken before courage could catch up. By morning, Grace was no longer hiding in her apartment. She was moving quietly through the city in a baseball cap and a gray coat, riding the subway from Queens to Brooklyn, from Brooklyn to Lower Manhattan, following the names on the vendor records like breadcrumbs through a forest built from shell companies and polite theft. She met a former Whitmore accountant in the back corner of a public library near Bryant Park. The woman, Nora Fields, had tired eyes and a canvas tote clutched against her lap. I was told the community program cuts came from Caleb, Nora whispered. But the requests never came from his office. They came from Richard's temporary finance committee. Grace slid a folder across the table. Can you prove it? Nora hesitated. If I speak, I lose my pension. Grace wanted to say she understood, but she did not want to insult the woman by pretending the cost was equal. Grace had lost her reputation. Nora could lose her retirement, her security, her health coverage. So Grace said the only thing that mattered. I will not use your name unless you choose to give it. But if Richard sells the company, people like you will be blamed for numbers he changed. Nora looked down at the folder. Slowly, she reached into her tote and removed a flash drive. There are emails, payment approvals, vendor lists. He used 3 nonprofits as cover. Grace took the drive carefully, as if it were made of glass. Thank you. Nora's voice shook. Do not thank me yet. Richard has friends everywhere. Grace almost smiled. Then we will have to be quieter than his friends. The next stop was a small insurance office in Brooklyn, where the community center's health outreach policy had lapsed because the board had frozen payments. Grace used nearly every dollar left in her savings to cover the emergency premium for 30 more days. The clerk behind the desk looked at her signature, then at her face. You are the woman from the news. Grace kept her pen moving. Today I am the woman paying the bill. It was not bravery that kept her standing. It was motion. As long as she moved, she did not have to feel the empty place on her finger. As long as she collected proof, she did not have to replay Caleb's saying. She made her choice public. But every few hours, the pain found her anyway. It came when she passed a bakery where he used to buy cinnamon rolls after early charity events. It came when she saw a dark blue suit in a crowd, and her heart betrayed her by hoping. It came when she opened her bag and saw the real engagement ring sealed in the envelope with the vendor record she still had not delivered, because she no longer knew whether Caleb would see it as proof or another performance. At the same time, Caleb was beginning to see the shape of her absence everywhere. The tower ran smoothly. Meetings began on time. Stock reports stabilized. Richard congratulated him on appearing strong. Sloan sent a handwritten note saying, you deserve someone who understands legacy. But Caleb could not stop noticing what had gone quiet. The foundation inbox was flooded with urgent messages that no one had shown him. A Bronx food program had lost its winter grant. The Newark clinic had delayed pediatric appointments. The Brooklyn Community Center was closed under Richard's authority, though Caleb had never approved it. Daniel brought the files to his office just after dusk. "This is worse than we thought," he said. Caleb stood at the window. The city spread beneath him in 1,000 lights that suddenly looked less like power and more like responsibility he had failed to hold. "Why did no one tell me?" Daniel's answer was careful. "Because the summaries you received were edited." Caleb turned. "By whom?" Daniel placed a printed authorization sheet on the desk. Richard Vale's signature sat at the bottom, elegant and undeniable. Caleb stared at it until the letters seemed to darken. Then Daniel added, "There is something else. The insurance payment for the Brooklyn Center was made this afternoon." "By Whitmore." "No," Daniel paused. "By Grace." Caleb did not move. The name passed through him like weather changing. "How much?" "Enough to keep services active for 30 days, if we reopen the building." Caleb looked down at the payment record. Grace had been called greedy on national television that morning. By evening, she had used her own savings to protect strangers connected to his company. The office seemed to tilt around him, not violently, but with the slow rearrangement of truth. "Where is she?" Caleb asked. Daniel checked his phone. A staff member saw her near the community center 20 minutes ago. Caleb was already reaching for his coat. Rain had returned by the time he reached Brooklyn. It fell softly, silver under the streetlights, collecting on the hood of his car as he stepped out across from the chained building. Grace stood beneath the awning with a box of donated supplies at her feet, speaking to 2 volunteers and the woman in the red coat from the night before. Her hair was damp. Her face was pale with exhaustion. She looked smaller than she had in the ballroom, and somehow stronger. Caleb crossed the street, but Grace saw him before he reached the curb. The volunteers went quiet. The little boy with the dinosaur backpack stared up at him. For a second, Caleb forgot every speech he had prepared. Grace held his gaze, guarded and wounded. "If you are here to ask whether this is another negotiation," she said, "the answer is no." Caleb looked at the chained doors, then at the box of supplies, then back at the woman he had not defended when the world called her selfish. His voice came out rougher than he expected. "Why are you still saving things that have my name on them?" Grace's expression flickered, and for one dangerous second, she looked close to telling him everything. Then a black sedan rolled slowly past the curb behind him. Grace's eyes shifted to it. Caleb saw fear, quick and controlled, before she buried it. She stepped closer, not tenderly, but urgently, and slipped a sealed envelope into the pocket of his coat. Her voice turned cold enough for anyone watching to believe it. "Because guilt makes rich men generous." Caleb stared at her, stunned by the cruelty of the words and the trembling of the hand that had just given him proof. The sedan stopped at the corner. Grace stepped back into the rain, her eyes begging him not to follow while her mouth said, "Go back to your empire, Caleb." He stood there as she turned away, feeling the envelope heavy against his chest, and understood at last that Grace was not pushing him away because she had stopped loving him. She was pushing him away because someone was still watching. Caleb Whitmore did not open the envelope right away because the moment Grace Ellison walked away from him, the rain seemed to swallow every sound except the words she had forced herself to say. "Because guilt makes rich men generous." They were ugly words, cold enough for anyone watching from the black sedan to believe she meant them. But Caleb had seen her hand tremble when she slid the envelope into his coat pocket. He had seen the fear in her eyes when the sedan slowed at the corner. He had seen the old Grace beneath the performance, the woman who once stood beside him at this same community center and whispered, "Your father did not build this place for cameras. He built it so people would have somewhere warm to stand." Now she was standing in the rain with no warmth left for herself. Caleb took one step after her. Grace stopped without turning. "Do not follow me." Her voice carried across the wet sidewalk, sharp enough for the watching car, broken enough for him. "Grace." She turned then, and under the streetlight he saw how tired she was. Not tired like someone who had lost sleep. Tired like someone who had been carrying a building on her back and apologizing because it cast a shadow. "You cannot be here," she said. "I own this building. That is exactly why you cannot be here." The volunteers behind her exchanged uneasy glances. The woman in the red coat pulled her little boy closer, sensing a private storm inside the public one. Caleb lowered his voice. "I know about the insurance payment." Grace's face tightened. "Then pay yourself back and call it generosity." "Stop doing that." "Doing what?" "Making yourself sound cruel when you are the only person in this city still protecting people who have no way to protect you back." Her eyes glistened, but she smiled as if cameras were inches away. "That would make a nice speech for your next fundraiser." Caleb took the hit without flinching. Who was in that car? Grace looked past him. The sedan had not moved. Its windows were dark, reflecting streetlights and rain, but Caleb could feel a tension behind the glass. Grace's voice dropped. "Someone who wants to know whether I gave you anything. Did you?" She stepped closer, close enough that the reporters across the street would think they were arguing, close enough that Caleb could see raindrops caught in her lashes. "No," she said loudly. "I gave you exactly what rich men always want. A chance to feel like a hero." Then, softer, almost without moving her lips, she said, "Do not open it here." Caleb's chest tightened. "Come with me." "I cannot." "Yes, you can." "No, Caleb." For the first time, anger broke through her exhaustion. "You still think this is about taking me somewhere safe? There is no safe place when the people chasing the truth sit on your board, sign your checks, brief your lawyers, and smile beside you at press conferences." The truth of it struck him harder than accusation. His empire had walls, guards, private elevators, legal teams, and yet every one of those things had been used to isolate him from the truth. Grace had no security, no family name, no fortune, and she had gotten closer to the rot inside Whitmore legacy than he had from the top floor of his own tower. Then tell me how to help, he said. Grace looked at him, and for 1 second, the mask nearly fell. He saw the woman he loved there, terrified and fierce, still choosing him from a distance he had helped create. Believe the evidence before you believe your pride, she whispered. The black sedan's engine turned over. Its headlights brightened. Grace instantly stepped back, her expression hardening for whoever watched. Go home, Caleb. Your empire needs you more than I ever did. The sentence was meant to wound. Instead, it revealed the wound she had been protecting. She turned and walked down the block, shoulders straight, disappearing beneath the rain and city lights. Caleb did not follow. Not because he wanted to obey her. Because for the first time since the ballroom, he understood that love, if it was going to help her, had to stop acting like possession. He stood there until the black sedan pulled away, then returned to his car with the envelope burning against his chest. Daniel was waiting in the front passenger seat, laptop open, phone pressed to his ear. He ended the call when he saw Caleb's face. Was it her? Caleb sat in the back and took out the envelope. The paper was damp at the edges from the rain. His name was written across the front in Grace's hand, not the elegant public script she used for invitations, but the hurried private handwriting he knew from sticky notes on his refrigerator and foundation briefing folders. Caleb opened it carefully. Inside was a vendor transfer record, a printed email chain, a list of 3 shell companies, and a small velvet pouch. His breath stopped before he even touched it. Daniel watched him through the mirror. Caleb opened the pouch. The real engagement ring fell into his palm, the one he had given Grace in his father's rose garden, not the display duplicate resting in his office safe. The diamond looked smaller than it had in the ballroom, and somehow more sacred, stripped of cameras, chandeliers, and lies. Folded around it was a note. Caleb opened it with fingers that no boardroom had ever made shake. Grace had written only one sentence. I broke your heart because they were going to break your father's promise. The city outside blurred behind the wet glass. Caleb closed his hand around the ring, and the last pieces of doubt inside him began to fall apart. Daniel picked up the vendor record and scanned the first page. His face changed. This authorization came from Richard's committee. Caleb looked at the note again, at the words father's promise, at the woman he had allowed the world to call greedy, while she emptied her own savings to keep his father's center alive. Shame moved through him, but beneath it came something sharper, cleaner, and more dangerous than grief. Purpose. Daniel, Caleb said quietly. Pull every payment tied to these vendors since my father died. Daniel nodded. And Richard? Caleb slipped the ring back into the pouch and held it like a vow he was not yet worthy to make. Richard wanted Grace to look like the lie. Now we are going to show the board who has been writing it. Caleb Whitmore did not return to the tower as a wounded fiancé. He returned as the son of a man whose promise had been stolen in pieces, one clean invoice at a time. By dawn, the 62nd floor of Whitmore Legacy Tower was lit like a command center, though no one spoke above a murmur. Daniel Price sat with 2 trusted analysts at the conference table, laptops open, coffee untouched, faces pale from what the numbers had begun to reveal. Shell vendors that did not provide services. Community grants redirected through consulting firms with empty addresses. Insurance funds delayed, then marked as administrative savings. Every trail Grace had found led back toward Richard Vale's temporary finance committee, and every signature had been placed carefully enough to keep Caleb's name close, but never directly involved. It was elegant. It was patient. It was exactly the kind of betrayal that wore a tailored suit and asked about your father at dinner. Caleb stood at the window with Grace's real engagement ring in his palm, watching morning bleed over Manhattan. The city looked innocent from that height, washed in silver light, but below it were locked community doors, unpaid clinic bills, food programs waiting for approval. People who would never know their hardship had been turned into a line item. He did not just want the company, Caleb said quietly. He wanted to hollow it out and sell the name. Daniel looked up from his screen. The buyer is almost certainly Mercer Capital. Caleb turned. Sloan. Daniel nodded. Her father's firm. There are draft acquisition documents hidden under a consulting project name. Richard signs over key assets after you are removed. Mercer Capital absorbs the debt. Sloan becomes the public bridge back to stability. Caleb gave a cold, humorless smile. And Grace becomes the scandal that made it necessary. He closed his hand around the ring. For hours, he and Daniel worked backward through Richard's maze. They found a version of the altered prenuptial agreement uploaded from an executive assistant account connected to Richard's office. They found calendar records showing Richard met Sloan twice in the week before the engagement broadcast. They found a payment to a public relations consultant who had fed the first gossip site the leaked contract. But proof was not yet enough. Richard had survived 4 decades in rooms where truth needed permission to speak. Caleb needed something that would survive a board vote, a courtroom, and the press. At 9:17 a.m., Daniel's phone buzzed. He read the message and looked at Caleb. Nora Fields is willing to talk. Caleb remembered the name from Grace's notes. The former accountant. The woman with the pension. Where? Public library near Bryant Park. She asked for Grace. The room went still. Caleb looked down at the ring again. Then Grace should decide whether to come. Daniel hesitated. Do you know where she is? Caleb did. Not because he had tracked her like property. Because a volunteer from the community center had called the tower at sunrise and left a message for him personally. Miss Ellison slept in the office chair after organizing supply lists all night. She said not to tell you. Caleb arrived in Brooklyn 40 minutes later without press, without Richard's security, without the black sedan that usually followed him. He found Grace inside the dark community center, sitting at a folding table beneath emergency lights, surrounded by donation forms, coffee cups, and children's drawings that had been taken down from the walls before the closure. Her hair was pulled back loosely. Her face was pale with exhaustion. When she saw him, she stood too quickly, as if her heart had moved before her pride could stop it. "You should not be here," she said. Caleb held out the velvet pouch. "This belongs to you." Grace stared at it, then looked away. "No, it belongs to who we were before all this. Then I will hold it until we find out if those people survived." The words made her eyes glisten, but she folded her arms, building the wall again. "Did you open the envelope?" "Yes." "And?" Caleb took a breath. "I believe you." The silence that followed was almost too fragile to touch. Grace looked at him as if belief were a language she had forgotten how to hear. "You were supposed to believe me before strangers made it logical." He lowered his eyes. "I know." That answer did more than an apology could have, because it did not defend him. It did not polish the damage. It let it stand in the room between them. "Nora Fields wants to speak," he said. "She asked for you." Grace's expression changed. Fear first, then purpose. "Richard will know. Probably. And if she comes forward, he will try to ruin her. Then we protect her correctly this time." Grace looked at him, hearing the weight beneath correctly. Not with money first. Not with a speech. With proof, consent, and care. She picked up her coat. "Then let us go." At the Bryant Park Library, Nora Fields waited in the quiet reading room with her tote bag under the table and both hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea. When she saw Caleb, she almost stood, but he stopped several feet away, careful not to crowd her. "Miss Fields," he said, "you do not have to speak to me because of my name." Nora looked at Grace. Grace nodded. "Gently. Tell him only what you choose." The older woman swallowed. "Richard told us the funding cuts came from your office. He said your father's programs were sentimental expenses and that you were too distracted by the wedding to notice." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Grace watched the pain cross his face and vanish into discipline. Nora removed a folder from her tote. "These are the original approvals. These are the altered versions. And this," her hand trembled as she pulled out a printed email. "This is where Richard's assistant asked me to backdate a vendor review. I refused. 2 weeks later, I was offered early retirement." Caleb took nothing until Nora pushed the papers toward him. "Consent." Grace noticed. So did Nora. They spent nearly an hour documenting the chain. By the time they left, Caleb had enough to call an emergency independent audit. Grace thought that might be the first breath of safety. Then Daniel called. His voice came through Caleb's car speakers, tight with urgency. "Richard just moved the board vote to tonight. He is calling it a leadership confidence review." Caleb's eyes darkened. "He knows." "There is more," Daniel said. "Sloan will be there. Mercer Capital representatives are already in the building." Grace looked at Caleb, rain beginning again against the windshield. "He is forcing the sale before we can finish." Caleb opened the velvet pouch and looked at the ring one final time before closing it. "No," he said, voice calm and dangerous. He is walking into the room where Grace finally gets to stop being the villain. The emergency board meeting began at 7 p.m. beneath lights so bright they made every lie in the room look clean. On the 71st floor of Whitmore Legacy Tower, the conference room stretched behind glass walls with Manhattan glittering below, distant and beautiful, as if the city had no idea how many lives could change because of one vote around one polished table. Richard Vail sat at the center of the room, not at the head, because men like him preferred to look modest while arranging power around themselves. His silver hair was perfect, his dark suit flawless, his expression heavy with false regret. Sloan Mercer sat 2 chairs away in a cream blazer, her hands folded, her face shaped into the gentle concern of a woman ready to become useful. Representatives from Mercer Capital waited near the far wall with leather folders on their laps. Caleb Whitmore entered without grace at first. Every board member looked toward the door behind him, expecting scandal, expecting weakness, expecting the broken man from the broadcast. Caleb gave them none of it. He wore a charcoal suit, his face calm, his eyes darker than the city outside. Daniel Price followed with a laptop and a stack of sealed folders. Richard rose slowly. "Caleb, thank you for coming under difficult circumstances. Tonight is not personal. It is about protecting Whitmore Legacy Group." Caleb took his seat at the head of the table. "That is the first honest thing you have said this week, Richard. It is about protection. The question is whom you are protecting it from." A thin silence spread across the room. Richard smiled faintly. "Emotion is understandable after what Miss Ellison did to you. But this board cannot allow private humiliation to cloud judgment." Sloan leaned forward, her voice soft. "Caleb, everyone here respects what your father built. No one wants to take that from you. But the public sees instability. The altered agreement, the broken engagement, the foundation questions. You need a stabilizing partner." Caleb looked at her. "Is that what Mercer Capital calls itself now?" Her smile faltered. Richard tapped a folder in front of him. "We have a proposal that protects shareholders, preserves the Whitmore name, and provides you with a dignified transition while an interim leadership structure is established." "You mean you remove me tonight, sell the assets tomorrow, and call the burial a restructuring?" Murmurs moved around the table. Richard's eyes cooled. "Careful, Caleb." Caleb leaned back. "I have been careful my entire life. That is how I missed what was happening in my own company." Richard turned to the board. "This is exactly the concern. Grief, betrayal, emotional volatility. We all watched Miss Ellison accuse him publicly of loving the empire more than her. Then we learned she had negotiated excessive financial terms. The brand cannot withstand another week of romantic chaos." Caleb's hand tightened once beneath the table. Not from doubt. From remembering Grace standing in the rain, pretending cruelty while saving evidence against the man now using her pain as a presentation point. Bring her in, Caleb said. Daniel opened the conference room door. Grace Ellison stepped inside. She wore a simple black dress under a tan coat still damp from the rain, her hair pulled back, her face pale but steady. She did not look like the greedy woman from the headlines. She did not look like a social climber or a villain. She looked like someone who had walked through shame and arrived carrying the truth. Every eye turned toward her. Sloane's expression hardened before she could soften it. Richard stood. This meeting is closed. Caleb did not look away from Grace. Not to the woman you used to start it. Grace walked to Caleb's side, but not behind him. Beside him. The difference was small enough for cameras to miss and large enough for every person in the room to feel. Richard gave a controlled laugh. This is inappropriate. Grace looked at him. So was threatening me with forged documents in the bridal suite. The room went still. Caleb opened the first folder. Let us begin there. Daniel connected the laptop to the wall screen. The first image appeared, the will clause Richard had used to pressure Grace. Then the altered audit reports. Then metadata showing edits made from an account tied to Richard's temporary finance committee. Daniel's voice was calm but sharp. The documents shown to Miss Ellison before the engagement broadcast were manipulated to make Mr. Whitmore appear responsible for financial misconduct. The timing was designed to trigger the emergency removal clause in Thomas Whitmore's will. Richard's face remained composed, but one hand moved toward his cuff link and stopped. Digital trails can be misunderstood. Caleb nodded. That is why we brought witnesses. The door opened again. Nora Fields entered with a legal representative beside her. Her hands shook, but her chin stayed lifted. Grace stepped toward her, not touching, only close enough to steady without pressure. Nora placed a folder on the table. I was asked to backdate vendor reviews and redirect community funds through companies that did not provide the services listed. A board member leaned forward. By whom? Nora looked at Richard. By Mr. Vale's office. Richard's voice sharpened. This is absurd. Caleb changed the screen. 3 shell vendors appeared, then payment records, then emails between Richard's assistant and Mercer Capital, Sloane's father's firm. The room erupted into controlled chaos, board members whispering, attorneys reaching for phones, Mercer representatives avoiding eye contact. Sloane stood quickly. My family firm receives proposals constantly. That does not prove collusion. Grace turned to her. No, but the public relations invoice does. Daniel displayed the next file, payment to a media consultant, followed by the first leaked version of Grace's altered prenuptial agreement. The upload source traced back to Richard's executive floor. Caleb lifted the final page, the real agreement Grace had signed. Miss Ellison asked for nothing beyond separation of assets and protection for the foundation. He looked at the board, voice low and controlled. She was painted as greedy because Richard needed me ashamed, distracted, and alone. Richard's mask finally cracked. She broke you on national television. Grace faced him fully. Because you told me if I warned him, you would release forged evidence before midnight and force the board to remove him by morning. Richard pointed at her, not violently, but with old contempt dressed as authority. You expect this board to believe a foundation employee over me? Grace's voice did not rise. That made it stronger. No, I expect them to believe the records you forgot poor people learn to save, because no one believes them the first time. Silence fell. Caleb looked at her then, and everyone in the room could see what he had failed to see sooner. She had not stood in front of the cameras to destroy him. She had stood there to pull the trap onto herself. Caleb turned back to the board. Richard Vale is removed from all operational authority effective immediately, pending independent investigation. Mercer Capital's proposal is rejected. Community funding is restored tonight. And one more thing. He reached into his pocket and placed Grace's ring on the table, not as a spectacle, but as proof. The woman you called a liability saved this company when everyone paid to protect it looked away. Richard looked around the table and found no rescue waiting. Sloane gathered her purse in silence, her perfect sympathy gone. Grace exhaled for what felt like the first time in days, but she did not reach for the ring. Caleb noticed. Pain crossed his face, quiet and deserved. The empire had been saved. The truth had been spoken. But when the board began voting to suspend Richard, Grace stepped away from Caleb's side, because clearing her name was not the same as healing the heart he had not known how to trust. Grace Ellison left Whitmore Legacy Tower before the board finished voting because staying would have made the room believe the story was complete. Richard Vale had been suspended. Mercer Capital's proposal had collapsed. Sloane had walked out without a word, her careful sympathy abandoned on the polished conference table beside the documents that exposed her family's ambition. Caleb Whitmore had restored the community funding with one order, called for an independent investigation with another, and stood before the board like the kind of leader his father would have recognized. The empire was safe, at least for now. But Grace did not feel saved. She rode the elevator down alone, watching the glowing numbers fall from 71 to lobby level while her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored doors. Her name had been cleared in a room full of powerful people, but the pain still sat in her chest, quiet and heavy. Being believed after proof arrived was not the same as being trusted before the world demanded evidence. Outside, rain had stopped. Manhattan smelled of wet pavement, exhaust, and late-night coffee. Grace stepped through the revolving doors without waiting for Caleb, without waiting for reporters, without waiting for anyone to decide what she was supposed to be now. Villain, hero, fiancé, former, fiancé, the woman who saved the company, the woman who broke a billionaire's heart. None of those names felt like hers anymore. She took the subway to Brooklyn and returned to the Whitmore Community Center just before midnight. The chains had been removed from the doors. Daniel must have sent someone as soon as Caleb gave the order. Inside, the emergency lights still glowed, soft and yellow, over folding chairs, bulletin boards, and cardboard boxes of donated coats. Grace walked through the lobby slowly, touching the back of one chair, then the edge of the welcome desk, as if making sure the place was real. This was what she had protected. Not stock, not marble, not a family name carved into towers. This, a warm room where people could begin again. She found a bucket of flowers left from an old event, half wilted but not gone. She filled a plastic pitcher with water from the small kitchen, trimmed the stems with office scissors, and began placing them in cups along the front desk. It was a small act. A useless act, maybe. But Grace had always believed beauty mattered most in places that had been told to survive without it. When Caleb arrived, he did not come in with security or lawyers. He stood in the doorway for a moment, rain still caught on his coat, watching her set a bruised yellow flower into a paper cup. He looked less like a billionaire than he ever had, and more like the man who had once stayed late after a foundation event stacking chairs because Grace had said leadership should leave a room better than it found it. "I thought I might find you here," he said. Grace did not turn right away. This place needed flowers. So did I. The words were gentle, but she closed her eyes, because gentleness was harder to defend against than pride. "Caleb, I know." His voice was rough. "I know I do not get to walk in here because the board voted correctly and asked you to forget what happened." She turned then. He stood several feet away, hands visible, posture careful, as if he understood that love could not be reclaimed by stepping closer before he was invited. In his hand was the velvet pouch. Grace saw it and looked down. "The ring does not fix this." "I know. Neither does exposing Richard." "I know. And I am not a prize waiting at the end of your redemption." Caleb's face tightened with pain, but he nodded. "You are not." That answer quieted the room. Grace had expected him to argue, to explain, to offer a polished apology wrapped in promises. Instead, he let her words stand, and somehow that made her want to cry. Caleb walked to the bulletin board near the entrance, where an old photograph of his father had been pinned above a quote about dignity. Thomas Whitmore was smiling in the picture, one hand on the shoulder of a young man from a job training class. Caleb looked at it for a long time. "I spent my life protecting his empire," he said. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot what he built it for. I thought if I kept the company standing, I was keeping his promise. You protected the part of it that was still alive." Grace's fingers tightened around the scissors. "I protected it because you loved it. And I let you stand alone because I loved it badly." She looked at him then, and the honesty in his face hurt more than his doubt had, because it arrived too late to prevent the wound but not too late to matter. He stepped forward only far enough to place the velvet pouch on the desk between them. "I had the ring cleaned," he said softly. "Not changed. Not made bigger. Not made more impressive. Just restored." Grace stared at the pouch. "Caleb, I am not asking you to wear it tonight." His voice shook slightly, and he did not hide it. "I am asking you to keep it until I become the kind of man who should have believed you before the evidence did." Her breath caught. The old Caleb would have made a vow sound like an acquisition. This Caleb sounded like someone finally willing to earn what money could not buy. Grace opened the pouch. The diamond rested inside, quiet under the community center lights. No cameras, no chandeliers, no board members measuring its meaning. Folded beneath it was a narrow strip of silver, newly engraved, not on the outside for anyone else to see, but inside the band where only she would know it was there. "Not the Empire. You." Grace read the words once. Then again. Her eyes filled, but she still did not put it on. Instead, she closed the pouch around the ring and held it in her palm. "If I come back," she said, "it will not be because I saved your company." Caleb's eye stayed on hers. "I know. It will not be because the world finally knows I was not lying. I know. It will be because you choose me when there is nothing to gain from it." Caleb took one breath. "Then let this be the first choice." The next morning, the community center reopened. No press had been invited, but people came anyway. Mothers with children, retired workers, volunteers, staff who had been told their programs were over. Caleb unlocked the front doors himself while Grace stood beside him with a box of fresh flowers. Not behind him, not in front of him, beside him. Weeks passed before she wore the ring again. Caleb did not ask every day. He showed up instead. At the food program, at the clinic hearing, at the board reforms, at Grace's mother's house in Ohio, where he washed dishes after dinner and let her mother ask every difficult question twice. And on a quiet Sunday afternoon, inside the restored community center, Grace finally slipped the ring back on her finger while Caleb was helping a little girl tape paper flowers to the wall. He saw it from across the room and went completely still. Grace smiled softly. "Do not make a speech." Caleb crossed the room, eyes bright, voice barely above a whisper. "Then I will only say thank you." She touched his hand. "No, Caleb. Say you understand." He looked around the room, at the people, the flowers, the open doors, the promise no longer trapped in a tower. Then he looked back at her. "I understand. The Empire was never the thing worth loving. It was what love was supposed to protect." Grace slid her fingers through his, and this time, when the room filled with applause, it was not for a billionaire, a scandal, or a perfect public image. It was for two people who had lost the lie, faced the truth, and chosen each other without needing the world to approve.